In the 41st millennium, there are no gods, only forces so vast that faith mistakes them for divinity. The emperor sits entombed in gold, 10,000 years of psychic will holding back the darkness. Chaos writhes in the immaterium, sustained by mortal emotion and ancient hunger. And yet, on a cold Martian morning in 999.M41, something fell from the space between spaces that was neither god nor demon, neither warp spawn nor material construct. It simply was, blue, luminous, and utterly impossible. The Fabricator General of Mars received 17 contradictory reports within the first 3 minutes. Augur arrays screamed data that made no sense. Auspex readings showed radiation signatures that should have vaporized half the Forge world. Gravity wells fluctuated wildly around Olympus Mons, then stabilized to perfect normality. And, in the center of it all, picked up by a maintenance servitor's ocular implant before the feed went dead, stood a naked blue man examining his own hands with the detached curiosity of someone conducting an experiment. The figure stood 2 meters tall, his body comprised of what appeared to be coherent energy rather than flesh. Every surface of his form glowed with soft azure luminescence, casting stark shadows across the rust-red regolith. He turned slowly, taking in the landscape, the towering forge spires belching promethium smoke into the thin atmosphere, the endless manufactory complexes stretching to the horizon, the crimson sky choked with industrial haze. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes moved with precise, calculated observation. "Fascinating," Dr. Manhattan said to no one in particular, his voice resonating with harmonics that bypassed auditory processing entirely and seemed to vibrate directly within the observer's mind. 10,000 years. The technological regression is comprehensive. He knelt, pressing one glowing hand against the Martian soil. Instantly, his consciousness expanded outward, perceiving the molecular structure of the planet itself. The ancient water locked in subsurface ice, the iron oxide that gave Mars its characteristic color, the network of plasma conduits and geothermal taps that honeycombed the crust. Deeper still, he perceived the tectonic stresses, the cooling core, the gravitational relationship with Terra hanging in the void above. Information flooded through him in cascading streams of quantum data. Then, he reached the forge complexes, and his perception fractured. The technology registered as simultaneously primitive and baroque, vacuum tubes alongside plasma reactors, mechanical gears integrated with anti-gravity suspensors, human brains wired directly into machines that chanted binary prayers. But more disturbing was what surrounded the technology. A presence, a weight of belief so intense that it seemed to warp probability itself. The Mechanicus didn't simply use their machines, they worshipped them. And somehow, impossibly, that worship made the machines function better than they should. Dr. Manhattan stood abruptly, his luminous form flickering as he processed this impossibility. In his universe, belief was neurological pattern, measurable, predictable, ultimately meaningless beyond its impact on human behavior. Here, belief seemed to be a force as fundamental as gravity or electromagnetism. Before he could investigate further, the air around him shimmered. Space folded in ways that violated causality. And suddenly he was surrounded by 12 Skitarii Rangers, their galvanic rifles trained on his chest, bionic eyes analyzing him through a dozen spectrums simultaneously. Behind them, a Mechanicus Dominus approached, his mechanodendrites writhing like metallic serpents, his face more skull than flesh beneath the red hood. "Identify yourself, anomaly," the Dominus commanded in binary cant that Manhattan understood through pure contextual analysis. "You have violated the sacred soil of Mars without authorization. Your energy signature defies the machine god's laws. State your nature and purpose, or be reduced to constituent atoms for analysis." Manhattan regarded them with the same detached interest he might show a colony of bacteria under a microscope. "I am Dr. Jonathan Osterman, though that name has limited meaning now. You may call me Dr. Manhattan. I came here by accident. I was observing a quantum anomaly in my own reality when something pulled at my consciousness, a force that operates outside causality as I understand it."
The Dominus's mechadendrites twitched with what might have been agitation or excitement. "Impossible. Our sensors detect you, yet our analysis subroutines cannot classify your composition. You register as energy, yet you maintain coherent form. You speak, yet you possess no vocal apparatus. You are—" The priest's voice actually stuttered, a digital glitch in his augmented speech. "An abomination of logic." "No," Manhattan replied calmly. "I am simply matter arranged in an unconventional configuration. At the quantum level, I am not substantially different from you. The distinction lies in conscious manipulation of atomic bonds rather than cellular biology." He raised one glowing hand, and the air above his palm shimmered. Atoms assembled themselves from ambient molecules, oxygen, nitrogen, trace elements, coalescing into a perfect crystalline structure that rotated slowly in the thin Martian atmosphere. "Observe. Matter obeys predictable principles. I merely perceive those principles more directly." The crystal dissolved back into component gases. 17 additional Skitarii materialized from concealed positions, their weapons charged and ready. The Dominus stepped closer, his optical sensors whirring as they cycled through analysis modes. "You claim to manipulate matter at the atomic level through conscious will alone. Such capability should be impossible without warp taint. Yet," he extended an Auspex scanner toward Manhattan, frowning at the readout. "You register null for warp contamination. 0 psychic resonance. This should not be possible." "I don't know what warp taint means," Manhattan admitted, and for the first time, something flickered across his usually impassive features, something that might have been curiosity or possibly concern. "But I've noticed something troubling since my arrival. Usually, I perceive events with complete clarity. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously to my consciousness. I can observe the atomic trajectory of every particle, predict every outcome with certainty." He gestured toward the forge spires. "But when I attempt to perceive the mechanisms within those structures, or the patterns of beliefs surrounding them, my precognition fails. There are blind spots, genuine uncertainty." The Dominus froze, his mechanical body going absolutely still. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from hostile to something approaching reverence. You perceive the Omnissiah's mysteries and find them opaque to your comprehension. This is appropriate. The machine god's wisdom transcends mortal or apparently post-mortal understanding. He lowered his aspects, his mechanodendrites retracting slightly. I am Dominus Archmagos Deltron 97, by the authority granted to me by the Fabricator General of Mars. I remand you to Mechanicus custody for theological and scientific evaluation. You will not resist. It wasn't a question. Manhattan looked past the assembled Skitarii, his gaze seeming to pierce through the Martian surface to perceive the vast complexes below. Millions of tech priests laboring in the forges, servitors slave to eternal tasks, the slow pulse of Mars's industrial heart beating in binary rhythms. And beyond Mars, hanging in the void, like a jewel carved from compressed history, he saw Terra. He perceived its continents reshaped by millennia of war, its oceans reduced to toxic sludge, its atmosphere choked with incense and industrial effluent, and at its heart, buried beneath miles of architecture and faith, something blazed with a light that even his quantum senses recoiled, something that should not exist, yet undeniably did. "Very well," Manhattan said quietly. "I will accompany you. I have questions about this reality, and I suspect you have questions about me. Perhaps we can reach mutual understanding." The Dominus gestured, and the Skitarii closed ranks around the blue figure. As they marched toward a waiting Mechanicus transport, none of them noticed the way Manhattan flickered, just for an instant, existing simultaneously in 3 locations at once before resolving back into singularity. He was already testing the limits of his powers in this strange new universe, probing the boundaries of what remained possible, and wondering for the first time in decades whether coming here was an accident at all.
The transport bay smelled of secret oils and ozone, a combination Manhattan found redundant, given that smell itself was simply molecular detection. Yet the Mechanicus seemed to assign spiritual significance even to their maintenance rituals. He watched as a tech priest anointed the transport's engine housing with blessed unguents while chanting in binary, and noted how the machine's output efficiency increased by 0.7% immediately afterward. Impossible, yet measurable. They descended into the Martian crust through kilometers of excavated tunnel, past forge complexes that had operated continuously for 10 millennia. Manhattan observed everything with total clarity: the heat signatures of plasma forges, the electromagnetic fields pulsing through power conduits, the chemical composition of atmosphere scrubbers laboring against industrial pollution. But whenever he attempted to perceive the future trajectory of these systems, his precognition stuttered and failed. It was like trying to solve an equation where the variables kept changing based on what the observers believed they should be. Deltron 97 had not stopped speaking since they boarded. "Your arrival constitutes a theological crisis of the highest magnitude," the Dominus explained, his mechanodendrites gesturing with mechanical enthusiasm. "A being of pure energy, capable of atomic manipulation, appearing from nowhere with zero warp signature. Some of my colleagues will argue you are a fragment of the Omnissiah himself. Others will demand immediate molecular disassembly to understand your construction. The Fabricator General will likely authorize both approaches simultaneously." "I am not divine," Manhattan replied. "I am simply a human who experienced an accident involving intrinsic field manipulation. The accident restructured my atomic bonds, allowing me conscious control over my quantum state. There is no mysticism involved, only physics." "Physics is mysticism when sufficiently advanced," Deltron 97 countered.
The Omnissiah teaches that machine and spirit are one. Your existence appears to prove the point empirically. The transport shuddered to a halt deep beneath Olympus Mons, in a chamber that registered as nearly absolute zero despite being surrounded by forge heat. They emerged into a cathedral of technology, vaulted ceilings studded with cogitator arrays, walls lined with analysis terminals, and at the chamber's center, a throne of crystalline computational substrate that pulsed with thinking light. Dozens of tech priests turned to observe Manhattan's arrival, their augmetic eyes whirring in synchronized focus. Before anyone could speak, an alarm shrieked across multiple frequencies. Emergency lighting bathed the chamber in crimson, and every tech priest immediately activated combat protocols. Deltron 97's mechanodendrites snapped into weapon configurations, and his voice crackled with digital urgency. Warp breach detected. Demonic incursion imminent. All units to. Reality tore open. The wound in space screamed with colors that had no names, with geometries that violated physical law. Manhattan perceived it as a rupture in the fundamental fabric of causality itself, a place where the deterministic universe ended and something else began, something that operated on different principles his precognition could not model or predict. And through that wound came creatures that should not exist. They manifested as writhing masses of flesh and metal, demons that had corrupted themselves with stolen technology, their forms bristling with weapons grown from their own bodies. Pink and blue horrors capered between them, giggling with voices that bypassed auditory processing and stabbed directly into consciousness. And at their head strode something that wore the shape of a tech priest, but moved with predatory grace no human should possess. A demon of Tinche, wearing stolen flesh like an ill-fitting coat. Flesh and machine in discord, it shrieked in a voice layered with harmonic impossibilities. The changer of ways has seen you, blue anomaly. You who exist outside fate. You who might tip the scales. The Skitarii opened fire immediately. Galvanic rounds and plasma bolts filled the air with coherent death, and several lesser demons dissolved into warp stuff under the barrage. But the greater demons simply laughed, reality warping around it as bullets curved away from impact, as energy weapons dissipated into harmless light. Manhattan observed the phenomenon with intense focus. The demon wasn't blocking the attacks through physical force. It was changing probability itself, making successful hits retroactively impossible. This was the warp phenomenon the Mechanicus had mentioned, a dimension where thought and reality merged, where consciousness could reshape physics through sheer will. It fascinated him. The demon pointed one twisted claw at Manhattan, and reality inverted. Space folded into non-Euclidean configurations. Time ran backward and forward simultaneously, and Manhattan felt something attempting to unmake him at the quantum level, not through atomic disruption, but through conceptual erasure, trying to make it so he had never existed.
Then he reassembled himself 40 meters to the left, his form flickering as he distributed his consciousness across multiple simultaneous positions to prevent targeting. "Interesting," he said, his voice carrying across the chaos of battle. "You manipulate probability and causality through some form of psychic projection, but your control is imprecise, emotional, rather than calculated." The demon shrieked laughter. "Calculation is the lie mortals tell themselves. There is only change, only the eternal dance of possibility." It gestured, and a wave of warp flame surged toward Manhattan, not physical fire, but burning unreality that consumed matter and energy alike. Manhattan raised one hand. The atomic structure of the air between them crystallized instantly into a wall of pure carbon, perfectly arranged into diamond lattice. The warp flame struck it and passed through. Manhattan flickered backward as the flame consumed the diamond wall and continued forward, unimpeded by physical matter. His precognition had failed to predict that outcome. The flame wasn't burning matter, it was burning the concept of existence itself. And concepts, he realized with genuine alarm, were not something he could manipulate at the quantum level. A mechadendrite wrapped around his ankle, and Deltron 97 yanked him sideways with augmented strength. "The warp does not obey your physics," the Dominus shouted. "It operates on belief, on emotion, on the collective unconscious of thinking beings. Your atomic control means nothing against it." Manhattan processed this information in microseconds. If the warp operated on consciousness rather than physics, then perhaps... He closed his eyes, though the gesture was purely symbolic. His perception expanded outward, no longer focusing on atomic structures but on something more fundamental. He perceived the tech priests around him, not their bodies but their minds, the patterns of electrical impulses in their augmented brains, the way their thoughts synchronized through noospheric data sharing, the collective belief in the machine god that pulsed through their neural networks like a heartbeat. And he perceived how that belief was affecting reality. Where the tech priests maintained discipline and faith, the demons' power weakened slightly. Where fear crept in, where doubt fractured their certainty, the warp stuff grew stronger. Consciousness and reality were entangled here in a way that violated every principle of quantum mechanics Manhattan understood. Yet it was undeniably real. The demon charged forward, and Manhattan made a choice. He didn't try to disintegrate it at the atomic level. He suspected that wouldn't work on a being that wasn't fully material. Instead, he perceived the space around the demon and rearranged it. Oxygen molecules became iron. Nitrogen became lead. In a perfect sphere 10 meters in diameter, the atmosphere transformed into solid metal, encasing the demon in a prison of instantaneously formed alloy. The demon laughed from within its cage, its voice undiminished. "Clever! But matter is illusion, blue thing! Watch as I—"
The demon's laughter cut off with a wet crunch. The remaining lesser demons shrieked in chorus and fled back through the warp rift, which sealed shut with a sound like reality sighing in relief. Silence fell across the chamber, broken only by the labored breathing of wounded Skitari and the hum of overtaxed cogitators. Manhattan stood motionless, staring at the sphere of compressed metal floating before him. Inside, something that had been a daemon was now reduced to its constituent atoms, scattered and crushed beyond any possibility of coherence. He had won, but the victory felt hollow, because for the first time since his transformation, he had acted without complete understanding. He had faced an enemy he could not fully predict and had been forced to improvise. It terrified him more than the demon had. Deltron 97 approached slowly, his optical sensors fixed on Manhattan with renewed intensity. "You killed a daemon of Tzeentch with atomic manipulation alone, without faith, without warpcraft, without even understanding what you faced." The Dominus's voice carried something approaching awe. "The Fabricator General must know of this immediately. You may be the key to fighting chaos without risking psychic contamination." "I don't understand this chaos," Manhattan admitted. "I don't understand how consciousness can directly alter reality. In my universe, such things were impossible." "Then welcome," Deltron 97 said grimly, "to the 41st millennium, where impossibility is the only certainty."
They brought him to Terra in a ship that traveled through hell. Manhattan stood in the observation deck of the Mechanicus cruiser Rational Certainty, watching as the Geller field generators hummed with desperate intensity. Beyond the translucent barrier, the immaterium writhed, a sea of impossible geometries and screaming faces, where distance was measured in belief rather than kilometers, and time flowed like water through broken fingers. His precognition, usually so reliable, shattered completely when he tried to perceive their route. Every possible future existed simultaneously in the warp, and none of them were certain until the moment of observation collapsed probability into reality. It was the most fascinating thing he had experienced in decades. "You should not be able to observe the warp directly," said a new voice behind him. Manhattan turned to find a figure in power armor the color of dried blood, bearing the symbol of the Inquisition emblazoned across his chest. The man's face was weathered like ancient leather, his eyes augmented with bionic implants that gleamed with cold calculation. "You said your name was Dr. Manhattan. Are you a new variant of psychic entity? I am no longer precisely human, and madness requires the capacity for irrational thought. I observe phenomena. I do not judge them as sane or insane, merely as data requiring analysis." The Inquisitor stepped closer, one hand resting casually on the bolt pistol at his hip. "I am Lord Inquisitor Koval of the Ordo Malleus. I have fought demons for 70 years, purged 13 worlds of chaos taint, and executed 463 heretics personally. I am here because the Fabricator General transmitted a report that should be impossible. A being of unknown origin who killed a demon through scientific principle rather than faith or psychic power." His augmented eyes focused with mechanical precision. "Tell me, Dr. Manhattan, are you a weapon sent by the ruinous powers to infiltrate Terra? Or are you genuinely ignorant of the danger you represent?" Manhattan considered the question with his usual detachment. "I represent danger to anything that threatens coherent atomic structure. But I have no allegiance to these ruinous powers. I barely understand what they are." "Then allow me to educate you," Koval said coldly. "The warp is the immaterium, the realm of souls and psychic energy that underlies physical reality. It is populated by demons born from mortal emotion. Korn feeds on rage and bloodlust, Nurgle on despair and entropy, Slanesh on excess and sensation, Tzeentch on ambition and change. They are gods in the truest sense, sustained by worship, capable of rewriting reality through sheer will, and they are utterly inimical to human existence." Manhattan processed this. Consciousness given form and agency, thought made manifest. In my universe, such entities would violate the conservation of energy. Here, they seem to be fundamental forces. "They are the fundamental force," Koval corrected. "Everything else, matter, energy, time, space, these are merely the materium's attempt to create order from the warp's chaos. The Emperor understood this. 10,000 years ago, he sits entombed on the golden throne, his psychic might holding shut the webway breach beneath Terra, his consciousness guiding the astronomicon that allows warp travel to function. Without him, humanity would drown in demon tide within a generation." The ship shuddered as something massive pressed against the Geller field. Manhattan perceived it as a pressure wave of pure malevolence, a concentration of consciousness so vast it could crush cities through proximity alone. The thing circled our vessel like a predator, then moved on, drawn by some other prey. "You said the Emperor sits on a throne, present tense, yet your description suggests maintenance of function rather than active governance. Is he alive or dead?" Koval's jaw tightened. "Neither. Both. He exists in a state between life and death,
sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily, their souls fed to him to fuel his psychic might. It is the cruelest necessity in human history, and the only thing preventing extinction. 1,000 humans per day, 365,000 per year, 10 billion over the 10,000 years you mentioned, and this is considered acceptable. Acceptable. Koval's laugh was bitter as ashes. Nothing about our existence is acceptable, Dr. Manhattan. We live in the most horrific civilization imaginable, where 1 billion souls mean nothing, where planets burn at an inquisitor's word, where children are press-ganged into factory work that will kill them by age 20. We are a species that has forgotten every ideal, every dream, every hope that once made us human. His augmented eyes glowed in the dim light. But we survive against demons and xenos and traitors and madness itself. We survive. And that is the only virtue that matters. The ship lurched violently, and alarm klaxons screamed across all frequencies. Manhattan perceived the problem instantly. A microfracture in the Geller field generators, allowing the barest tendril of warp energy to seep through. It was enough. In the lower decks, he observed 3 crewmen suddenly turn on their fellows with howling madness, their minds subsumed by demonic whispers that promised power and pleasure and blessed oblivion. He teleported.
The lower deck materialized around him in the space between heartbeats. The 3 corrupted crewmen had already killed 2 of their companions and were dragging a third toward the fracture point, where warp stuff leaked through like poisonous fog. Manhattan observed their bodies on a molecular level. Neural structures rewriting themselves, synapses firing in patterns no human brain should accommodate, flesh beginning to warp as the demonic influence spread. He reached out with his consciousness and froze every atom in their bodies simultaneously. The corrupted crewmen became statues, trapped in mid-motion as their atomic bonds locked into perfect stasis. They were alive, technically, but incapable of movement, thought, or further corruption. Manhattan stepped past them and examined the Geller field fracture, perceiving the way warp energy interacted with physical matter. It was like watching oil and water try to mix, reality and unreality grinding against each other with apocalyptic friction. He couldn't repair the generator. That required understanding of technology he didn't possess, but he could seal the breach. Atom by atom, he restructured the metal plating around the fracture point, creating a barrier of such perfectly arranged atomic bonds that even warp energy couldn't penetrate. The fog receded, hissing like a living thing forced back into its cage. Koval arrived moments later with a squad of armed servitors, bolt pistols raised and ready. He took in the scene: 3 frozen heretics, a sealed breach, and Manhattan standing calmly amidst what should have been a catastrophic failure. "You contained a warp incursion through atomic manipulation," the Inquisitor said slowly. "Again, without faith, prayer, and sanctified rites." The warp appears to be constrained by physical law at the point of intersection with reality. If I maintain the structural integrity of the barrier between dimensions, the warp cannot pass through. It's simply a matter of ensuring zero tolerance for atomic deviation. "Simply," Koval repeated, something dangerous entering his voice. "You speak of manipulating the fundamental forces of reality as though describing a mechanical process. Do you understand what you represent, Dr. Manhattan? You are a being who might fight chaos without falling to corruption, who might seal warp breaches without risking possession, who might, Emperor, forgive me for thinking it, render psychers obsolete."
Manhattan met the Inquisitor's gaze with his usual impassive stare. I am a being who observes and acts according to logical principle. I don't understand your faith-based reality yet, but I am learning. Every interaction provides more data. And what will you do with that data when you understand how this universe operates, when you perceive the full scope of humanity's suffering? Will you help us, abandon us, or decide we're not worth saving? It was, Manhattan realized, the same question he'd faced in his own universe. When you possessed the power to reshape reality, what obligation did you have to those who didn't? When you could see all possible futures, which one did you choose to actualize? And when you'd lost the capacity for human emotion, how did you decide what mattered? Before he could formulate a response, the ship's Vox system crackled to life. Approaching Terra, all personnel prepare for standard orbit. The throne beckons. Manhattan returned to the observation deck and watched as Terra resolved from the warp-churned void. The planet was nothing like the Earth he remembered. Continents buried under endless cityscape, oceans reduced to toxic sludge, and the atmosphere thick with pollution and prayer. But it was still recognizable, still home in some fundamental sense. And at its heart, buried beneath mountain ranges of architecture and faith, something blazed with psychic light so intense it made Manhattan's quantum senses recoil. Something vast and terrible and utterly impossibly alive, despite being entombed in dying flesh. The God Emperor of mankind. "You wanted to understand our reality," Koval said quietly, standing beside him. "You are about to meet the being who literally holds it together through sheer will. I pray, for our all sakes, that you can withstand the experience." Manhattan said nothing. He simply stared at Terra, at the Astronomicon blazing from its surface like a psychic lighthouse, and wondered if coming here was the greatest mistake of his existence, or the only choice that mattered.
The Imperial Palace was a monument to suffering converted into architecture. Manhattan walked through corridors that stretched for kilometers, past walls adorned with skulls of martyrs, through chambers where servitors, humans lobotomized and converted into biological machinery, performed eternal tasks with dead eyes. The air tasted of incense and decay, a faith so concentrated it became almost tangible. Koval led the way, his inquisitorial authority parting crowds of pilgrims and functionaries like a blade through water. But it was the presence that dominated everything. The closer they came to the throne room, the more Manhattan perceived it, a psychic pressure so immense it warped space-time itself. He observed photons bending in its gravity well, watched atoms vibrate at frequencies that should be impossible, felt his own quantum structure resonating with something that existed simultaneously in the materium and the warp. The Emperor was dying, had been dying for 10,000 years, and his death was so catastrophically slow that it had become a form of terrible life. "The custodian guard will escort you the final distance," Koval said as they reached a threshold of pure gold, guarded by warriors in armor more magnificent than any Manhattan had observed. "I am not permitted beyond this point. Few are." The Inquisitor's augmented eyes met Manhattan's luminous gaze. "Whatever you see in there, whatever he shows you, remember that you're standing before the single most powerful psychic force in the galaxy. The Emperor reads minds like you read atomic structures. He will know your every thought, your every intention, and if he judges you a threat, then what?" Manhattan asked with genuine curiosity. Koval smiled without humor.
Then you'll discover whether atomic manipulation can withstand divine wrath. For all our sakes, I hope it can. The custodians, 10 feet tall in their auramite armor, bearing guardian spears that crackled with power fields, formed up around Manhattan without speaking. Their discipline was absolute, their purpose singular. They had guarded the Emperor for 10 millennia, and would continue until the last atom of their being dispersed into entropy. The doors opened, and Manhattan entered the Sanctum Imperialis. The chamber defied physical description. It existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its geometry shifting based on the observer's perception. Manhattan saw it as a vast cathedral filled with machinery of impossible complexity, every surface engraved with psychic circuitry that burned with golden light. At the heart of the chamber sat the Golden Throne, part life support system, part psychic amplifier, part prison and sanctuary combined. And upon it sat what remained of the master of mankind. The Emperor was a corpse. His flesh had withered to parchment stretched over ancient bones, his body riddled with tubes and cables that pumped nutrients and psychic energy through dead tissue. But his mind, his consciousness blazed with such intensity that Manhattan's quantum senses recoiled from direct observation. This was a being who existed across multiple planes of reality simultaneously, whose thoughts moved through the warp with the force of stellar winds, whose will held shut a breach in reality through sheer psychic determination. Dr. Jonathan Osterman, the man who became more than man. I have observed your arrival with interest.
Manhattan stood perfectly still, analyzing the phenomenon. The Emperor's communication wasn't telepathy as he understood it. It was direct consciousness-to-consciousness contact, a form of information transfer that operated outside normal space-time. "You perceive me clearly," Manhattan stated. "Yet I struggle to perceive you. The warp interferes with my precognition. I cannot predict your actions or intentions. Because I exist simultaneously in past, present, and future," the Emperor responded, and Manhattan felt something like amusement in the psychic resonance. "Much as you do. But where you observe all timelines with detachment, I actively shape them. I am the anathema to chaos, the ordered will that opposes the warp's madness. And I have been dying for 10,000 years to maintain that opposition." Manhattan processed this. "You sustain yourself through sacrificial consumption of psychic humans, 1,000 per day, a grotesque necessity predicated on the assumption that your existence prevents something worse. Not assumption, certainty." The psychic presence intensified, and suddenly Manhattan perceived what the Emperor held back, a vast wound in reality beneath the throne, a gateway into the webway that bled warp stuff like an arterial hemorrhage. Beyond that breach, demons pressed against the Emperor's psychic barrier in numbers that defied counting. Billions, trillions, an infinite tide held back by a single dying will. "If I fall, Terra falls. If Terra falls, the Astronomicon fails. If the Astronomicon fails, humanity loses warp navigation and fragments into a billion isolated worlds. Within a generation, chaos consumes them all. This is not prediction, it is mathematical certainty." Manhattan observed the scenario across multiple probability vectors. The Emperor was correct. Without the psychic lighthouse of the Astronomicon, humanity's interstellar civilization would collapse. Isolated worlds would fall to chaos incursion, Xenos invasion, or simple entropy. The species would survive in scattered pockets, but its capacity for unified action would vanish. Then you are trapped.
unable to die without triggering extinction, unable to live as anything but a conscious corpse. This is your reality. Yes, the word carried 10,000 years of exhausted resignation. And now you arrive, a being who manipulates matter without warp taint, who perceives quantum states without psychic gift. Tell me, Dr. Manhattan, could you repair this body? Could you reconstruct the Emperor's flesh at the atomic level and free him from this throne? Manhattan considered the question seriously. He examined the Emperor's withered form on a molecular level, perceiving the damage that millennia of psychic strain had inflicted. The cellular degradation was absolute. The DNA had fragmented beyond recognition. The neural pathways had fused and refused so many times they resembled scar tissue more than functional biology. But theoretically, yes, he could rebuild it. Atom by atom, cell by cell, he could reconstruct a functional human body. It would take time, weeks, perhaps months of continuous effort, but it was possible. I could repair your physical form, Manhattan said slowly, but I cannot replicate your psychic power. If I rebuild your body, you would become human again, mortal, limited, incapable of maintaining the barriers you currently hold. The webway breach would open fully. Terra would fall. Precisely. The Emperor's presence seemed to settle, like a vast weight accepting its burden once more. There is no escape, only eternal duty. I tell you this so you understand what humanity has become, a species that sacrifices everything, including its own soul, for mere survival. Before Manhattan could respond, reality screamed.
The warp breach beneath the throne convulsed, and Daemons pressed forward with renewed fury. Manhattan perceived them clearly now, entities of pure consciousness given form through mortal belief and emotion. They were Zinch servants primarily, creatures of change and ambition, and they had been waiting for precisely this moment. They sense your presence, the Emperor warned, his psychic might surging to reinforce the barriers. They perceive you as a threat to their eternal game. Chaos fears nothing more than a being who operates outside its influence. The breach widened by microscopic degrees, and a greater daemon forced its way through, not fully, but enough. Its form was a nightmare of crystalline mutation and impossible geometry. Its voice a chorus of contradictory certainties spoken simultaneously. "The Blue Prophet," he shrieked in ecstatic revelation. "The one who sees all futures yet chooses none. The changer of ways has foreseen you. You will be the catalyst. You will bring change beyond comprehension." Manhattan observed the daemon's form analytically. "I have no interest in your god's plans. Interest is irrelevant. You are the fulcrum, the moment of decision. Even now, your presence alters probability vectors. The Emperor dies in 17 configurations. He lives in 9, but in 3. In precious, beautiful 3, you make a choice that reshapes everything." The custodians moved to intercept, but Manhattan raised one hand. The daemon was already retreating, its message delivered, pulled back through the breach by the Emperor's renewed psychic assault. The wound in reality sealed once more, and terrible silence fell across the sanctum. "The gods of chaos have declared their interest in you. They will not stop. They will tempt you, corrupt you, or destroy you, and they will use humanity as their weapon to do so." Manhattan stood motionless, processing the encounter. The daemon had spoken of choice, of futures branching based on his decisions. His precognition might be blind to the warp's influence, but apparently the warp's own prophets could still perceive his impact on causality.
He was a variable in an equation he didn't fully understand, and variables could tip balances. "What would you have me do?" Manhattan asked the dying god corpse on the golden throne. "What you were always going to do," the Emperor replied. And for the first time, Manhattan detected something like sadness in the psychic resonance. "You will observe, you will analyze, and when the moment comes, when you must choose between detachment and action, you will discover whether you remain human enough to care about anything beyond atoms and equations." Manhattan had no response to that. He simply turned and left the sanctum, the golden doors sealing behind him with the finality of a tomb closing. Koval waited beyond, reading Manhattan's expression, or lack thereof, with practiced skill. "He showed you the truth, didn't he? The full scope of our damnation." "Yes," Manhattan confirmed. "You are a species that has converted suffering into survival mechanism. And I am apparently a piece on a board whose rules I cannot fully perceive." "Then what will you do?" Koval asked. Manhattan looked up through the palace's impossible architecture, through kilometers of stone and steel and faith, toward the stars that burned in the toxic Terran sky. "I will do what I have always done," he said quietly. "I will observe until action becomes necessary. And then I will act according to whatever principles remain meaningful in this reality." "That's not an answer," Koval said. "No," Manhattan agreed. "It isn't."
The assault on Terra came 3 days later, and it came from within. Manhattan stood on the Eternity Wall, observing the Imperial Palace's outer defenses with detached interest, when his precognition suddenly crystallized with terrible clarity. For the first time since arriving in this universe, he could see the immediate future with perfect accuracy, because the threat wasn't warp-based, it was physical, molecular, atomic. A cult had been growing in Terra's underhive for generations, worshippers of the plague god who had spent decades engineering a biological weapon specifically designed to overcome the palace's defenses. Manhattan perceived it now. Billions of viral particles, each one a masterpiece of demonic-enhanced mutation, being released into Terra's atmosphere from 17,000 hidden locations simultaneously. The pathogen would reach the outer palace walls within 4 hours. Within 8, it would penetrate to the inner sanctums. Within 12, it would reach the throne room itself. The Emperor's custodians were immune, their enhanced biology proof against mortal disease. But the millions of functionaries, servitors, administratum workers, and menial laborers who kept the palace functioning, they would die screaming, their bodies converting into plague-ridden corpses that would themselves become vectors for further corruption. And in the chaos, Nurgle's Daemons would pour through the weakened psychic barriers and assault the Golden Throne directly. Manhattan teleported. He materialized in the Senatorium Imperialis, where the High Lords of Terra convened in emergency session. They recoiled at his sudden appearance, a glowing blue figure manifesting from nowhere. But Lord Inquisitor Koval was already present and raised a hand for calm. "The plague," Manhattan stated without preamble. "I perceive its molecular structure. It spreads through airborne transmission, targets human respiratory systems specifically, incubation period of 90 minutes, mortality rate approaching 100%. Without intervention, Terra will lose 43% of its population within 2 days." One of the High Lords, a master of the administratum whose face had been replaced by a tactical cogitator array, spoke in clipped, desperate tones. "We've detected the outbreak. Quarantine protocols are already failing. The pathogen mutates too rapidly for conventional countermeasures. Lord Koval, your recommendation." Koval's expression was granite. "Atmospheric purge. Incinerate the lower hive levels with phosphex bombardment. Cauterize the infection before it spreads."
That would kill 8 billion people, another High Lord objected. Better 8 billion than 80 billion, and far better than losing Terra entirely to Nurgle's corruption. We initiate purge protocols in— No, Manhattan interrupted. Every eye in the chamber turned to him. Koval's hand moved toward his bolt pistol. Dr. Manhattan, this is not your decision to— I can neutralize the pathogen, not cure the infected. Their cellular damage is too severe. But I can restructure the airborne viral particles at the molecular level, transform them into inert proteins. The plague will die in the atmosphere before it spreads further. The master of the administratum's pogitator arrays whirred frantically, processing probability calculations. Impossible. The pathogen is distributed across 7,000 cubic kilometers of atmosphere. The molecular manipulation required would exceed— I exist simultaneously in multiple locations. I can divide my consciousness and distribute my presence across the entire planetary surface. It will require 47 minutes of complete focus, during which I will be vulnerable to attack. But it is possible. Koval stepped forward, his augmented eyes searching Manhattan's luminous face. Why? You've shown nothing but detachment since your arrival. You observed the Emperor's suffering without emotion. You analyzed our damnation like a laboratory experiment. Why suddenly care about 8 billion humans you've never met?
Manhattan was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried something that might have been the ghost of human emotion. Because I have stood on Mars and watched your technology worship itself into functionality. I have walked through your underhives and observed generations living in darkness they believe is necessary. I have knelt before your dying God and seen him sacrifice everything for a species that can barely remember what hope feels like. He turned to face the High Lords directly. You are the most horrific civilization imaginable, but you are also the most determined. You have converted suffering itself into an act of defiance against a universe that wants you extinct. And that interests me. Interest is not enough reason to risk yourself, the Master of the Administratum objected. Perhaps not, Manhattan agreed. But I find myself curious about what humanity might become if given the opportunity to survive without catastrophic loss. Consider this an experiment. If I fail, you can still initiate your purge protocols. But if I succeed, he looked directly at Koval, then perhaps even in the 41st millennium, are there alternatives to absolute brutality? The Inquisitor held his gaze for 3 full seconds, then slowly nodded. The Emperor protects, he said quietly, even when his instruments are strange and blue and operate outside all doctrine. You have 47 minutes, Dr. Manhattan. Make them count. Manhattan ascended. His consciousness expanded outward, dividing and subdividing until he existed in 17,000 locations simultaneously. Each instance of himself appeared above one of the cult's release points, a glowing blue figure materializing in the toxic skies of Terra, clearly visible to the billions of citizens below. Some screamed, some prayed, some simply stared in confused wonder. And Manhattan began to work. He perceived the viral particles as they spread through the atmosphere. Complex protein structures wrapped around RNA cores, each one engineered to bypass human immune responses and trigger catastrophic cellular breakdown. They were elegant in their way, a masterpiece of biological horror clearly touched by demonic influence but functioning through purely physical mechanisms, which meant they were vulnerable to atomic manipulation. Manhattan reached out with 17,000 simultaneous instances of will and began restructuring reality at the molecular level. Each viral particle he touched was transformed, proteins unwound and rewoven into harmless configurations, RNA cores dissolved into constituent nucleotides, the demonic taint itself dispersed as the physical substrate that contained it ceased to exist. It was the largest act of conscious atomic manipulation he had ever attempted. In his own universe, he had built structures, destroyed weapons, even walked on the sun's surface, but he had never simultaneously edited billions upon billions of molecular structures across thousands of cubic kilometers while maintaining perfect precision in each transformation. It was exhausting in a way he hadn't experienced since his transformation. But it was working. The plague died in the atmosphere, particle by particle, as Manhattan's divided consciousness processed each one individually. Below him, he observed the cult members who had released the pathogen, screaming in frustrated rage, watched as inquisitorial death squads descended on their positions, saw the traitors executed without mercy or hesitation, and then he felt the warp convulse. Nurgle had noticed his interference. The plague god's attention turned towards Terra like a diseased sun focusing its rays through a magnifying glass. Reality warped, and demons began manifesting across the planet's surface, not through careful ritual or prepared breaches, but through sheer overwhelming force as Nurgle spent accumulated power to punch through the Materium's defenses. He couldn't fight them. Not while maintaining his divided attention across 17,000 simultaneous molecular transformations. If he broke focus, the plague would continue spreading. If he ignored the demons, they would slaughter millions while he worked. He needed help.
And in the 41st millennium, help came in gold and oromite. The custodian god deployed across Terra in coordinated strike forces, their guardian spears carving through demonic flesh with contemptuous ease. They had fought beside the Emperor for 10,000 years, and their skill was absolute. Where Daemons manifested, custodians were already waiting, turning demonic incursions into efficient massacres. But there were too many. Even the Emperor's finest warriors couldn't be everywhere at once. Manhattan made a decision. He pulled one instance of himself, 1/17,000th of his divided consciousness, away from plague neutralization and directed it toward the largest demonic incursion. A great unclean one had manifested in the Hab districts, its bloated form vomiting diseased filth across entire city blocks, laughing with jovial malevolence as it corrupted everything it touched. Manhattan's instance appeared before it, and for a moment the daemon paused in surprise. "Little blue thing," it gurgled cheerfully. "Grandfather loves all his children, even strange new ones who think themselves beyond decay. Everything rots, little atom dancer, even certainty." Manhattan compressed the air around the daemon into solid lead, then collapsed it with the same technique he'd used on Mars. The great unclean one exploded into warp stuff and dissipated, its physical manifestation destroyed. But the effort cost him focus. 200 viral transformations went uncompleted in the seconds of distraction. The plague spread further in those microseconds, not catastrophically, but measurably. He couldn't fight both battles simultaneously. Unless... Manhattan reached out with his quantum perception, observing the custodians as they fought. He perceived their molecular structures, their enhanced physiology, the way their movements achieved maximum efficiency through perfect biomechanical optimization. And he had an idea. He appeared beside the nearest custodian, a warrior named Valdor, if the battlefield vox chatter was accurate, in his full unified form, abandoning the distribution strategy momentarily. "I need to enhance you.
your atomic structure. I can optimize your neural processing speed, reinforce your cellular cohesion, increase your combat effectiveness by approximately 43%. It will require 3 seconds of physical contact per warrior. Will you permit this? Valdor drove his guardian spear through an attacking Daemon's skull, then turned to face Manhattan with eyes that had seen the Emperor's glory firsthand. If it serves the throne, I permit all. Begin. Manhattan placed one glowing hand on Valdor's armor. Instantly, he perceived the custodian's entire physiology and began making microscopic adjustments. Neural synapses were reinforced at the atomic level. Muscle fibers were restructured for greater force transmission. Bone density was increased through precise calcium arrangement. In 3 seconds, Valdor became the most physically perfect version of himself possible within biological parameters. The custodian moved, and Manhattan observed the difference immediately. Faster, stronger, more efficient. Valdor's guardian spear became a blur of gold as he carved through 3 Daemons in movements that violated previous biomechanical limitations. Acceptable, Valdor stated, his voice carrying new resonance. Enhance the others. We'll hold the line while you complete your work. Manhattan redistributed himself once more, but now he split his focus 3 ways. 17,000 instances neutralizing plague, 300 instances systematically enhancing every custodian on Terra, and 1 instance remaining unified, standing atop the Eternity Wall, observing the battle with complete clarity. It was the most complex multitasking he had ever attempted. His consciousness stretched across millions of simultaneous actions, each one requiring perfect precision. He felt his quantum coherence strain under the load, felt the edges of his distributed self begin to blur. But he held. And slowly, inevitably, the battle turned. The plague died in Terra's atmosphere. The enhanced custodians pushed back the demonic tide with brutality. Nurgle's assault faltered, then broke, the plague god's attention withdrawing as the cost of maintaining the manifestations exceeded the tactical value. 47 minutes after beginning, Manhattan reconsolidated himself into a single unified form and stood alone atop the Eternity Wall, watching as Terra's defenders mopped up the remaining corruption. He had saved 8 billion lives. And he had discovered something profoundly disturbing about himself. He was capable of caring again. Not with human emotion, that remained forever beyond him, but with something like purpose, something like conviction that certain outcomes were preferable to others, even when observed from quantum objectivity. Koval found him there an hour later, standing motionless as Terra's toxic dawn broke across the palace spires. "The Emperor has sent word," he said. "He wishes to speak with you again. He says you have made your choice." Manhattan turned to face him. "I have not chosen sides in your galactic war. I have not pledged myself to the Imperium or any faction. I have simply decided that certain outcomes are worth working toward, even in a universe as broken as this one. That's all anyone can do, even gods."
Dr. Manhattan returned to the Sanctum Imperialis alone, walking past custodians who now moved with enhanced efficiency, their atomic structures optimized in ways that would perplex the Mechanicus for centuries. The Golden Throne blazed before him, and the Emperor's presence filled his consciousness like pressure from a collapsing star. "You chose to act," the Emperor observed, his psychic voice carrying what might have been satisfaction. "Not because I commanded it,
not because logic demanded it, but because you decided that humanity's suffering deserved intervention. Welcome back to the species, Dr. Osterman. You have been absent from it for some time. Manhattan stood before the dying god and considered this assessment. I am not human. I observe reality at the quantum level, exist outside linear time, manipulate matter through conscious will. I have more in common with your Daemons than your species. And yet you saved 8 billion humans you did not know, for no gain to yourself, at significant risk. That is the definition of humanity, not flesh and blood, but the choice to care when indifference would be easier. You have made that choice, repeatedly. What would you have me do now? I cannot remain on Terra indefinitely. My presence attracts chaos attention. The Daemons perceive me as a threat to their eternal game, and they will continue testing me until they find a weakness. Then do not remain, the Emperor said simply. Travel the Imperium. Observe what humanity has become across 1,000,000 worlds. Intervene when you deem it necessary, or do not. I will not command you, Dr. Manhattan. You are not my servant. Then what am I? A variable, a possibility, a being who might tip balances that have remained frozen for millennia. The Emperor's presence seemed to intensify, and Manhattan perceived something like hope radiating from the corpse god's consciousness. I have held this throne for 10,000 years, watching humanity descend into barbarism and zealotry because survival demanded it. But perhaps, just perhaps, your presence offers alternatives I could not previously perceive. You want me to find solutions that do not require absolute brutality, to prove that even in the 41st millennium there are paths beyond suffering and sacrifice. I want you to try, the Emperor said quietly. And if you fail, if this universe truly permits no other way, then at least we will know with certainty. Sometimes certainty is all we can hope for. Manhattan turned to leave, then paused. The Daemon spoke of futures where you die and futures where you live. It claimed I was the catalyst for those divergent outcomes. Can you perceive these futures as well? The Emperor was silent for a long moment, and when he finally responded, his psychic voice carried the weight of eons. I perceive thousands of possible futures, Dr. Manhattan. In most, I remain on this throne until Terra itself crumbles to dust. In some, I fall, and humanity drowns in Daemon tide. But in a precious few, something changes. Something breaks the eternal stalemate. Whether that change leads to salvation or damnation remains unclear, but it is change nonetheless. And you believe I am that change.
I believe you might be. Or you might be nothing more than an interesting anomaly who will observe for a time and then depart, leaving no lasting impact. The Emperor's consciousness seemed to regard him with something approaching warmth. Only you can decide which story you wish to tell, Dr. Osterman. Choose wisely. Even gods have limited opportunities to reshape reality. Manhattan left the sanctum and walked through the imperial palace, observing the billions of humans who labored within its corridors. They were not the humanity he remembered, not the people who had built cities of glass and dreamed of utopian futures. These were harder souls, shaped by necessity into instruments of survival, their hopes reduced to simply seeing another dawn. But they were still human, still capable of kindness amidst cruelty, still finding meaning in duty and sacrifice, still defying a universe that wanted them extinct through sheer stubborn determination.
He found Koval waiting at the palace entrance, the Inquisitor's expression unreadable. "Where will you go?" the old warrior asked. "I don't know yet," Manhattan admitted. "There are millions of worlds, billions of humans living in conditions I cannot yet comprehend. I will observe, I will learn, and when I perceive situations where my intervention might matter, I will choose whether to act based on principles I am still formulating." "That's the best any of us can do," Koval said. He extended one weathered hand in an ancient gesture of respect. "The Emperor protects, Dr. Manhattan, even strange blue gods who operate outside his doctrine." Manhattan regarded the offered hand, then reached out and shook it with perfect simulation of human warmth. The gesture felt significant in ways he couldn't quite articulate, an acknowledgement that despite his transformation, despite his quantum nature and atomic perspective, he remained connected to humanity in some fundamental way. He released Koval's hand and walked toward the palace gates, his luminous form casting blue shadows across golden walls. Behind him, Terra continued its eternal labor, billions of souls grinding themselves to dust to sustain a corpse god who held back extinction through will alone. Before him, the galaxy waited, a million worlds locked in endless war, where every victory was temporary and every defeat potentially final. It was the most horrific civilization imaginable. And yet, as Manhattan teleported away from Terra and began his journey through the Imperium, he found himself experiencing something he hadn't felt since his transformation decades ago: genuine uncertainty about the future. Not because his precognition had failed completely. The immediate futures of purely physical events remained crystal clear, but because his own choices had become unpredictable even to himself. He was no longer simply observing reality. He was participating in it, shaping it through action and inaction alike. And in a universe where consciousness could literally reshape matter, where faith could sustain dying gods and belief could birth demons, participation mattered in ways he was only beginning to understand. Dr. Manhattan looked up at the stars blazing in Terra's toxic sky, a billion suns marking a billion worlds where humanity clung to existence through faith and fury and absolute refusal to surrender. Some of those worlds would fall, some would endure, and perhaps, just perhaps, a few might even be saved by a blue figure who manipulated atoms and was slowly remembering what it meant to care. The Emperor had been right about one thing. Certainty was all anyone could hope for in the 41st millennium. But Manhattan had discovered something the dying god perhaps didn't know, that uncertainty, properly embraced, could be its own form of hope. He vanished into the void between worlds, leaving Terra behind, but carrying with him a question that would guide his journey through this dark future. In a universe where suffering was currency and brutality was necessity, could one being who existed outside those rules prove that alternatives were possible? He didn't know the answer yet, but for the first time in a very long time, Dr. Manhattan was genuinely interested in finding out. The Emperor protects. More stories await.